Future of Urban AI. We just want to welcome everyone back. This is the fifth in this season 3 of the Future of Urban AI webinar series. This is a joint production by my organization, the Urban Tech Hub at Cornell Tech, and Hubert Baroche and Urban AI in Paris. This is the fifth of this series. Full calendar is here, also available in the Eventbrite link that we'll show at the end of the session. Just want to point folks to a couple of resources related to this project. This is the New Horizon Scan, which is available in an alpha version at thefutureofurbanai.org. This is the first phase of research that will be continuing over the next few months in collaboration with Urban AI, really just trying to collect and catalog all of the signals and trends that we're seeing in this space with the particular lens of climate adaptation and resilience. This is also going to be the theme of the Urban Tech Summit that we're hosting at Cornell Tech on November 19th and 20th. And at that time, we'll release the full sort of beta version of this, which includes all of the detailed signals that were collected in the research. So definitely take a look at this, share feedback. You can contribute signals, examples of things that you see out there that we expect to be more widespread in the future. And we appreciate and acknowledge those contributions. There's also some resources related to this series. All the previous episodes from season 1, season 2, and I believe the first couple of the season 3 that we've been doing this fall are available at this short URL, tinyurl.com/futureofurbanai. And then a notebook report summarizing last year's lectures is available now at this URL, and we can share those in the chat as well. Today, we're really delighted to welcome Thijs Turel, who's the director of the Responsible Sensing Lab at the AMS Institute. For those of you who don't know about AMS, I'm sure Thijs will give us a little bit of background, but I think it's one of the leading, if not the leading, center of urban tech research, in the world. Coming up on 10th anniversary, I believe. Responsible Sensing Lab is a couple years old at this point. I have been following everything that's been going on there very closely since the beginning, and really, really excited to welcome Thijs, I think, to make a really timely contribution to this discussion. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Thijs.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this nice introduction. And thank you, Hubert and Anthony, for the opportunity to be here today. So my name is Thijs Turel. Let me quickly share my screen. Yeah, it seems to work, right? So my name is Thijs Turel. It's a bit of a hard pronunciation. And I have been at the AMS Institute for 6 years now, in the capacity of a program developer on the theme of responsible urban digitization. So the AMS Institute stands for the Amsterdam Institute for Advanced Metropolitan Solutions, and it has been set up as a long-term collaboration between 3 universities and the city of Amsterdam. And the universities being the Technical University of Delft, Wageningen University, and MIT, Massachusetts. And this is a very interesting setup because we can kind of keep the collaboration between the city and these universities ongoing as projects kind of come and go, and we can kind of develop new projects at the same time. And I've been asked today to present some of my thoughts on the theme of responsible sensing and what that can entail. So I've been looking back at the stuff we did the last 6 years, and I'll try to share some of my thoughts on what responsible sensing might entail and what it might not entail. So yeah, with no further ado, let's start that. So first of all, this is a series on the urban AI, and I need to kind of put this into a context a little bit because we have been looking at issues of urban AI, but largely from the perspective of the sensor or hardware involved in this. And why is that? Well, this is a kind of smart city situation. You see here, you see a sensor, you see an actuator, and But this is kind of what people can see, but there's a whole lot of other things kind of obviously happening at the back to make sure this system can kind of control or steer processes in the city. But we looked at sensors. So it's important to say that that's kind of just part of a system. I think it's an important part if you want to use to work towards responsible digital applications in cities, but it's just a part. And we looked at it particularly from that part. And it is interesting because it is the physical touch point that you can actually see. So that means that it is relatable for citizens. Well, it's maybe not that relatable, at least it's more relatable than a database, which is somewhere on a server in who knows what part of the globe. So it seemed like an interesting intervention point to also think seriously about citizen engagement and also ways to give citizens the means to, well, in a way, oversee or check what's going on with the smart city system. So it's interesting as a physical touch point because it's, I think, the most relatable part of these systems. And also because it is a touch point where you can, in a way, put some limitations on the capabilities of a system. Basically, if you don't sense something, then data doesn't come in, and then that data can also be used for not so nice purposes later on in the pipeline, right? So it can be interesting to think about it from the perspective of data minimization. And that is also something what I told you. Yeah, a little bit on our history, but I'll go over this quickly. In 2017, a group of concerned citizens came together and they drew up the so-called TADA list of values, which were things they thought were really important when you think about digitization in the city. And the interesting thing that happened thereafter was that the city of Amsterdam actually put these values in their coalition agreement, so the ruling policy document of the city. And we, as a responsible sensing lab, then got the task to figure out what these somewhat more abstract words actually can mean when you apply them to smart city systems, right? So if you take concepts such as autonomy or such as understandability or transparency or relatability, what does that mean then when you look at the nuts and bolts of the smart city? So that is also what we have been doing. But first start with what is responsible. And I want to start here with one of the definitions given to us by one of the principal investigators at the AMS Institute, Ibo van der Poel, who is in ethics basically. And he says, well, responsible can have two meanings, or maybe these meanings combined, right? So it can be about the process that you do with stakeholders, but it can also be the fact that you start from values. And I think we've been largely doing the second one, but also using one of the first approach in dealing with citizens and other stakeholders and how these systems might affect them in the long term. So in practice, we've been doing a lot of design probes and design sprints into the material artifacts and objects in the city and what these might look like from a responsible system. And this is how I structured my kind of presentation on several of the things we did, right? So something on how responsible sensing can be understood as empowering citizens vis-a-vis the government, something how we can see it as increasing transparency and also understandability, how it can be seen as maybe limiting function creep and putting some limits on kind of the power that governments can have with these systems, and also something about fair distribution of the affordances, but also about the actual sensors themselves. Yeah, so empowering. Well, the underlying idea here is that executive government branches on the local level have been set up to have professionals working on their behalf to think about how sensors can help them. And at some point, or digital technology can help them, it should be more broad. And ultimately, that might lead to a kind of disbalance in power between the local government and its citizens. So I've been thinking about how these affordances can actually also land with the citizens. So one of the pilots we did in the European Urbanite project was about using the Flemish Telraam sensor. So that is a relatively cheap sensor that you can use to count traffic and see how that actually works out when you hand this sensor to citizens in an area of Amsterdam. I participated also as in this pilot as a participant, so that was kind of an interesting double role. But it was really clear that even though the number of participants here was relatively low, what was really interesting is that they all seemed to have a clear theory of change. So they had a case in which they thought this sensor might help them to alleviate some of the concerns or to help them filing a complaint, particularly with their local government, the City of Amsterdam, right? So that would be about people speeding in front of their homes. It would be about too many lorries passing in front of their home, whereas they said this is not a road that's suitable for lorries. And they all felt comfortable with the data that was gathered by this sensor, and they felt they would get in a way further in the complaint process in the city. And that also turned out to be true. So their complaints were taken more seriously, impacted by data. So that was kind of a cool thing. We're right now in talks to see how we can maybe do this more mature, not on a pilot by pilot basis, but how can you make this part of the actual infrastructure of the city? And we thought if we're going to be lending out these type of devices to citizens, what is the more obvious place to do that than the local library? So we're trying to see if right now in talks with the library to have these sensors be part of the lending process there. And the idea behind this is that the libraries could help bring some awareness of this, could maybe also be a good place to provide the training for these type of devices, some support. I think these are the three reasons to do that, and it can also obviously scale if this would be successful. So that is one of the things in empowering. Another project that we've been working on with the City of Amsterdam's computer vision team is this idea of the Amsterdam generic scanning service. That is a whole lot of a name, but the idea here is basically that cities are responsible for the maintenance of public space. In order to do that, they need information that is right now still collected manually. But if you have a camera that drives around the city, that can be collected digitally. And that's what we're right now trying to set up as an internal department in the city to help other departments of the city to do their work in a way. So one of the first use cases is to see where there are these type of kind of dumpsters for construction trash, which have been put in the city without a license, because people need a license for that. Many of them don't actually go for this license, and that leads to a complaint. So the bike would be driving around, recognizing these containers, and then geolocating them, and then the enforcement personnel could kind of go there and check that. The second use case that they're right now investigating is the idea of these kind of temporary toilets that apparently also need a permitting process. And in that way, kind of the use cases stack up in order to justify the cost of having this kind of a bike system drive around the city. What was interesting here that was citizens have been invited to participate in the process to set up this generic scanning service, not thinking about the actual use cases, but in a way, how do we do this in the most responsible way? So basically, this is a kind of citizen participation that you could see as risk mitigation citizen participation. So a team of citizens have been part of this process for over a year, thinking about stuff that might potentially go wrong here and trying to mitigate that in the technology and how it's being used in the city. And one of the design approaches that came out of that is right now started with is the idea of what role should such a scanning bicycle actually play in the city, right? So the left image was an idea to have this bike as part of an infrastructure, right? So largely invisible. I mean, you can look this up, what the people are doing. There's a sticker on the back of this person's professional outfit. But this was just an infrastructure. You could also see this more as a means of enforcement, right? So you would have enforcement personnel driving around the bicycles. And the third option that they investigated was maybe this is a very useful point of contact, right? Because these are the civil servants that are most out there in a way. So why don't you give them the job also, and also the mandate to maybe answer questions, to maybe if people have complaints, to also take in these complaints and work on them. And this is something that is still kind of under consideration. Because obviously, if you would be a civil servant and you would be driving this bicycle in the way as expressed in the image on the right, it would take a whole lot more time to get your round done and actually collect the data. But then again, you would be really approachable. And the question is ultimately, what role do we want this scanning bicycle to play in the city? So another way how you can think about responsible sensing is to work on the idea of transparency, where the idea is that the democratic debate on the use of smart city systems is still somewhat lacking. Not enough people know about this, and that all starts with awareness. So if you want to raise awareness, you have to somehow show people what you're doing. So in Amsterdam, we are kind of lucky to have this sensor registry that has been online, I think, for 5 years now. But we also have seen the downsides in the sense that it's really hard to get all the different departments in the city to actually make sure that they have live and correct data of the sensors on this map. And also, and that's kind of a chicken and egg problem, that it's not being used that much by citizens. And then you can also debate about how much use can you ultimately expect of a system like this that kind of still caters to a niche audience. I mean, eventually, in all of us in our lives might at some point be interested in what a particular sensor might be doing, but not all of us are interested in it so much, right? So it should be there as a backup system. But then the problem is people don't even know that it's there, right? So we worked on the physical representation of transparency. One of the earlier things we did, I think this was already 6 years back, was work on the notion of transparency when charging electric vehicles. So if you charge electric vehicles in a smart way, a algorithm would decide which car to charge how much capacity and on what time. And the idea there was that at some point people will want to know why their neighbor's car was charged way quicker than theirs. So we designed this kind of intervention. Another thing we did was this so-called simple sensors modular idea of a sensor in public space, where the idea was that all these different Lego blocks, you should see them as Lego blocks, have a different function in explaining the public what the sensor can and cannot do, right? So there was a kind of design language, and the idea was that if you scale this, that well, some people will become familiar with the various functionalities, and that will also help them understand what it's doing. Well, obviously, you can't scale this because it's really looking kind of weird and people don't want that and it's kind of costly. So we looked at a more scalable version, which is also more boring, but it is a sign. So we spent the last 2 years developing a kind of a national standard for the communication on sensors in public space. So that's basically a process where you try to align a lot of cities that all have their own communication department that wants to have their brands kind of rule over the other brands. And also you have to be really clear what citizens actually want to know, because typically we did put up these signs, but then from a perspective of being legally compliant as a city, right? So what should be put on there not to get in trouble? And here we try to flip it and to ask people, what do you actually expect on a sign like this? So this is kind of a general design language that we right now offer to cities in the Netherlands. That basically has some icons that tell people what type of sensors there are and also what they do. And then obviously you can use this to get to some website if you want to have more information. But the idea was that it should cover the information need in 3 seconds, and people who want to know more can always kind of find more information. So this is, we right now piloted this also in other cities, also in The Hague and in Utrecht. And right now we're seeing how this can scale across the Netherlands. So slightly less conceptually interesting, but more practically feasible. Limiting function creep. That is another take I think we could have on responsible sensing. So the idea here is that there's a lot of power manifested in having a particularly infrastructure that you can use and redeploy for multiple purposes. We hope most of that beneficial, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You also I think if you're designing a city, maybe you shouldn't think 10 years ahead, but slightly longer than yet and longer than that. And then you never know what's going to be happening with these systems. So you should think carefully of what they can do, but also what you do not want them to be able to do. So this is also a line of design tropes. Yeah, the idea of function creep, I kind of like this definition by the school of Copes. So an imperceptibly transformative and therewith contestable change in a data processing system's proper activity, where the stress should be on imperceptibly, I think. So if something changes in a algorithm or a smart system in the city without somebody being in the know, that can lead to questions later down the line. And in this case, that would particularly be about the elected city representatives, but maybe also the public at large, right? So they say, hey, we never thought this was going to go this way. And that is, I think, a way how you can think about function creep. Where I think that in this line of work, we're particularly at risk of function creep happening because, well, the costs of making small adjustments to sensor systems that can have major ramifications can be quite small, right? So typical A cost is a way how cities get kind of ultimately in the city council, right? If something needs a decision that is about a lot of budget, then that will be put in front of the council. But if something doesn't need the budget, maybe it won't ultimately reach there. So one of the things we did over the years was the millimeter wave sensor. We're still working on that right now, where the idea was that cities need cameras to do counts and also to sense occupancy. And that can be of playgrounds, that can be of sports fields, that can also be in the red light district. And they typically outsource that to a market party, and the market parties always come back with a camera as a sensor because that's the cheapest to deploy. And sure, that's true, but it also raises concerns about privacy and data minimization. And in the Amsterdam context, it's interesting to know that the council actually promised the public that they should be able to move throughout public space unobserved. That was literally in a policy document. That's a hard promise to live up to, but still the city felt they needed to do something. Anyway, we played around with the idea of using a kind of low resolution radar instead of a camera to do this, where the idea was that this will unit the hardware, and this thing will never be able to be used, for instance, for biometrics or things like that. Still working on this right now. A sound classifier, another pilot that we are about to launch in the next couple of months, where the idea was that there have been some incidents here where the public was promised that a particular sensor or camera was not doing any recording, not doing any smart stuff, but actually it was, because it was still in training mode, right? That can also hold two other sensors. So this training mode is always a module where much more data is being collected, also much more is kind of recorded, and that gives sometimes that makes it hard for the deputy mayors to promise that really no recording is going on. So we're experimenting right now with the idea, what if you just separate this into devices, where one device in deployment mode would actually not capture very much, right? So the training mode would be storing everything, recording everything, and having a good connection. But the deployment box would be a really different box, having no storage, a hardware filter, in this case, on the sounds that we want to classify. So you only capture the audio that you really need to do this. And also maybe no 5G connection, but LoRa. So you really don't have the bandwidth to even transmit data, even if somebody would potentially hack into the system, right? So this is an idea of data minimization by the means of hardware minimization. And ultimately, the goal here is to reintroduce some costs and some friction to make sure that these systems will not be at some point kind of abused. The shutter cam, also an example that we have been working on for some years. We recently, the idea here is that if cameras that are in the city are often not actually turned on, but nobody knows that and nobody is in a position to know that. But if you make a shutter that can open and close, then the public can actually see whether they're opened and closed. And this right now even was put in front of the council, where one of the council members said, we want to investigate whether we can do this for all, I shouldn't say all, for a large subset of cameras in Amsterdam. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing this for the security-related cameras and the safety-related cameras, but for cameras that, I don't know, count only the occupancy of playgrounds on during the midday, they could easily be covered by a shutter and the rest of the time, because they're really not being used at that time. And the same holds for cameras that are being deployed for remote bridge opening. There again, you have the same logic. Another thing we encountered in this digitale gracht, so the digital canal system that we have, which is a elaborate sensor network that consists, I think, of 3 or 4 different types of sensors meant to monitor crowdedness and the traffic circulation on the Amsterdam Canal, so boats going around. And one of the things there that was they right now use a way to track individual vessels, and we are right now seeing whether that functionality cannot also be done by having slightly more sensors out there, but then sensors that do not have the capability to track individual vessels, and whether that would still allow the city department enough insight in what's going on, because you would be eliminating a risk there that is related to being able to know follow persons throughout the city. The next one, and I think we're almost approaching the end of this kind of slideshow. We've also been doing some work on the fair distribution of sensors. So, for instance, what you see on the left here is the air quality sensor network in Amsterdam. These are 11 sensors that are kind of fixed there. And I think there's also a sensor network that is more mobile, that they put at different locations. But the point is that the locations of these sensors have usually kind of historically grown. There's not much logic behind that. And there's also no notion of representation behind the way these are currently spread out through space. But that is in a way unfair. So there was this model by Rachel Franklin from Newcastle University, who had a way to model, in a way, a more representative deployment of these sensors throughout public space. And we were in talks with the city department to see if we could maybe we'll change the location of some of these sensors. Well, that's really hard in real time because people want to kind of keep the continuity of their kind of their data, right? They want to be able to compare this year's data to last year's data. And also it seems that it's also very much dependent on pragmatics, such as having a location there that is already being serviced by one service provider or kind of things like that. So it's really hard to come up with the budget and the need in the city context to go for a more, in a way, fair deployment of sensors that would, for instance, also monitor the air quality of the citizens of Amsterdam North or the south of Amsterdam. Because ultimately, if you're not being represented, you're also not being taken into the policy process. Another one that we're doing here is again a kind of a citizen sensing related thing where we're trying to design together with Leon Cassens from the TU Delft a low-cost sound classifier. So that can not just recognize sound levels, so decibels over a number of time, but also can recognize distinct events. And we are going to train this on events that citizens find relevant. And the idea also that you can use this kind of as an extension of the sound level network that's already in the city. Yeah, moving on. Yeah, so these are 4 different kind of takes on the notion of responsible sensing that we have explored over the years together with the academic partners and also with the partners at the City of Amsterdam. Yeah, I think it's probably incomplete. I think there are probably more kind of definitions of responsible sensing that you could take, I think. The things we did are sometimes also conflicting, right? So if you want to use this millimeter wave sensor as a kind of alternative to cameras, you can't at the same time also have cameras with shutters on them. And also the whole idea of changing known technology, because that's something you can say about cameras as a sensor that at least the public by now is familiar with them. If you replace that with a millimeter wave sensor, which is right now still unknown, that may not help transparency on understandability initially, right? So there's conflicts between these values. And I hope some of these examples have been inspirational to you. Moving towards the end. Oh yeah, a project that we recently started was a project on smart doorbells. So then particularly the doorbells that are kind of connected to a large cloud that have a AI assistance that's also capable of doing facial recognition, and that have apps on our phones that are really easy to use to look back over a long period, like 3 to 6 months, to see who was in front of your house or in front of your home. In the Netherlands, we have seen that in just a few years, there's right now 1.2 million of these doorbells. And that's quite a lot when you consider the fact that we only have 7 million homes here. So these doorbells are rapidly on the rise. And we're right now, and that leads to tensions within neighborhoods because some people don't like being filmed by their neighbors. We formed a coalition of Dutch cities. We're right now looking for non-Dutch cities that experience the same kind of issues to see how we can also kind of internationally align on these topics. Yeah, so that was it. If you're interested in this and you want to know the new design sprints that we will be doing, please subscribe to your newsletter. And then I'm open for some questions or discussion. I'm really curious.
Thank you so much, Thijs. We have a lot of questions in the chat room here, so I am going to start with Jonathan Pichot. If folks want to, Uber, I don't know if we can have folks come off camera and ask their questions. It might be nice to get a little more interactive this week. I should probably be able to do that. Let's see.
Just 1 second and we will do it.
If you want to make me a co-host, I can do the rest.
Jonathan is now on stage if he wants to.
Oh yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Very interesting on a number of topics. My question is, who do you think outside of the Netherlands, who do you see in terms of cities, initiatives, and other projects that you admire in responsible sensing? And who do you think is the most mature?
Gee, that is a good question, I would say. So I see that you are related to the Helpful Places kind of initiative. You also, I think, developed at some point a symbol set or an icon set that was not particularly, I think, meant for cities, but for place owners. I think the idea was. I thought that was, for instance, quite inspirational. I think it's interesting how in other European countries, particularly kind of German cities, there is much more, how do you say, concern about how these affordance of these systems might also ultimately be misused. So just 2 examples top of my mind. I will think if I can think of some more, Jonathan. Thanks for the question. No.
Okay, Ruth Nelson, who was a panelist 2 weeks ago, presenter in this series, has a question. Bear, we're going to make promote Ruth.
Yes, might be able to.
Yeah, I'm here. Should I ask my question or?
Please, yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I think my video is working. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really interesting. I did join a little bit late, so maybe I missed it. But my questions basically is obviously these sensors are collecting a lot of data. Where is this data being stored exactly? Is it on a cloud? Is it on a server? Who has access to it? And what kind of sort of policy frameworks does it feed into? I suppose, you know, the purpose of monitoring sort of a space for occupancy might be to test whether or not the public space is working effectively, with the aim to be improve the public space with the sensor data somehow. Yeah, what is the purpose of collecting, you know, occupancy data, for example? Thanks.
So I think these were 2 questions. So I would say that where the data is stored and how it's being handled, that differs hugely. Typically, how these things work is that the city aims to, in a way, centralize these type of things, but really it's all the different departments and the different sub-departments that have individual contracts with vendors that offer a service. And sometimes the data stays at the vendor, sometimes the data stays at the city. It depends. Some of fortunately, the departments that are somewhat more mature in this have in their new contracts with market parties situations where most of the data resides at the public side, so not at these companies. So that's hugely depends. Occupancy, for instance, that also depends on which department you speak to. For instance, the departments of sports here has the problem that all the sport fields in Amsterdam have been fully booked until 2027. At least that's in the online reservation system. But when you go there, there's hardly anybody there. So they don't have the means to actually see if somebody makes a reservation, whether they turn up and use the sport field. So they can't really enforce it. So that is frustrating. Therefore, they want to have a sensor that can just see, are there people using the sport fields right now or not, right? And if they are not, then we can do something. Then we can maybe open up the field. So that is, well, very much like a room reservation system, I would say, in a typical office space. And that's just one of the uses for kind of node occupancy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
We also have a question from Xiaofan Liang. You want to come on screen and ask?
Yes, thank you for the talk. I have two questions actually. So the first one is regarding specifically to the shutter cam. I didn't fully get, is the visual cue for the camera like the red paper on top of the camera? If so, like how do you show the signal dynamically, like whether the camera is on and off?
Yes, so the idea is basically that it works like this. So the thing that you probably have on your laptop, but then remotely operated. So the idea is that the city would be publishing, let's call it surveillance times, right? So we want to be able to monitor this street between 9 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And only in these times, kind of the shutter mechanism would open, and at 1 minute after 5, it would kind of close. And that was the most obvious way we could think of to make this kind of known. The response we got was still not obvious enough, because apparently if you see the opening and closing, then kind of it makes sense, but it's hard to make up what it means if it's in closed or opening position. But then again, we pivoted in a way to we think actually this is for the general audience not that interesting, but there is a subset of people who are concerned about these things and who also, I think, represent our collective interest when it comes to monitoring the use of these systems by cities, right? So we think for these group of people it should be enough audience in a way.
Okay, yeah, cool. That's very cool because same thing. I didn't realize how it functioned when I just see the photo when it's open. So like you said, right?
That's an example of why it's not fully. We were thinking of maybe just doing the, in the Pixar movies where they have this the lamp that is at the start of the Pixar movies, that the lamp typically pivots upwards at some point. Maybe that's even easier to have the whole camera pivot upward. But then there's something with bird poo and it needs more maintenance, so it's kind of a very practical problem. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I have a second question, which is about like what is the cost or a trade-off to use these responsible way to deploy sensors, if any, right? So if it's all really good, like why haven't it been widely adopted by other cities or other parties in the world?
Yeah, it depends on which one you're talking about, but they're all in a way a pain, right? If you just want to have the data, they're all a pain. It's not going to make your life easier if you're just after the data. Maybe if you change your perspective and you think you're not just after the data now, but you're after the data for the long time, and then you ultimately need some societal buy-in to the use of these systems. And that's where we think some of these interventions can actually play a role, right? So if at some point people start to protest the use of these sensors, and then the city council decides for certain things they kind of are going to be abolishing the use of sensors for that, then it will be even more costly for these departments. But still, it's a long struggle, right? So, instance, there's one civil servant right now looking into which cameras in Amsterdam could you potentially outfit with a shutter, right? So, I mean, the security camera in front of the residence of our mayor. No, we're not going to be putting a shutter on that one because we want to keep our mayor safe, right? So it doesn't work for that one. But you see then that there's a lot of internal pushback as well for people who don't like this, don't see the point, don't want to go this direction. So it is what we're trying to do is kind of open up what's possible. So in a way that our council members can have a choice. So right now they're not being confronted with a choice, and now we basically say to them, hey, if you ask for it, you can also have camera systems with a shutter or something like that. That will make it more costly, but it is something we can do. That's how it is supposed to work.
Just a little bit more deeper in that line. So would that say that there aren't really a lot of products like ready to use product in the market that like factor these responsible use into concern? So right, a lot of cost at the beginning would be to develop something new and testing that, and then that's why like partially that's what makes it costly, right?
Yeah, for instance, even if you do want to use a camera, right? Typically cameras you buy, they actually have privacy settings on the device, right? So there is ways in which these cameras can be configured to not transmit footage, to maybe even do blurring or counting on the device, right? But typically, if you take them from the box, these features are not enabled, right? So sure, okay, so yeah, you go into the money and you enable that. But once there's an update, of the firmware, who knows, right? So then these kind of systems go back to the non-privacy mode. So it's quite a lot of work, and we try to, for instance, look for cameras that kind of have these privacy options as a default. So as not a default that you can configure, but that once they come out of the box, and these are not available, probably because the market size is not big enough yet.
Okay, thank you for your.
Yeah, I should just point out one of our urban tech fellows this year at Cornell Tech, Tara Pham, is the founder and CEO of Numina, which is a company that works with business improvement districts in New York City to deploy privacy conscious cameras for sensing like pedestrian and cycling activity. So they have a solution. I think they have really struggled to penetrate the market because, you know, as Thijs just said, it's a pretty small market. Yeah, one last question from Spencer. Spencer, do you want to come on screen?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you all. This is a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask, it sounds like you're trying to extend your partnerships beyond the city of Amsterdam. I'm curious, like, what challenges you've faced with that so far. What challenges do you expect to face in extending that reach? And are there any particular forms of like governance or oversight that will be particularly effective in managing this kind of a technology?
Oh, gee. Let me answer that question in the context of this smart doorbell project that they're trying to do. Because that one seems, so we had a theory of change, right? So ultimately, it is Google and Amazon and Eufy and some other kind of manufacturers that decide how these doorbells function and look like, right? And it's really hard to make them change their designs. But the idea was, if we kind of come up with a list of feature requirements of how we think a doorbell should work and should function, you know, thinking about, I don't know, having some guarantees on local storage, how long the data is being kept, maybe having more clear, maybe no audio, right? Maybe so some of these things that would definitely help making this work in cities, right? So the idea was, if we have a letter signed by a long list of cities and we send it to their innovation departments, who knows, right? Maybe they will take it into consideration. And then it turns out that the smart doorbell thing seems to be a really Dutch problem, right? So the Germans are too privacy aware to even use these doorbells. In the UK, it seems everybody is using them and they do not find that a problem. So the problem we have here is that half of the Dutch seem to kind of be okay with them, and half of them do not seem to be okay with using these doorbells. And that leads to a kind of problem. So I've spoken to some Scandinavian countries. So they have more of this. Internationally speaking, there is the Cities for Digital Rights, Human Digital Rights Coalition. That is interesting in this perspective, I think. I think that there's a whole group of cities that are also concerned about these issues. So I'll be speaking to them on this smart doorbell topic shortly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So we're at time. I want to thank everybody for your questions. Thank Thijs for his presentations. I think my big glow coming away from this is this idea that we saw in the sound sensing project of essentially disconnecting a public sensor after its learning is complete and just letting it do its work locally. That's something new that I have never thought about, and it's really fantastic to see it being prototyped.
What do you think it would bring, Anthony?
What do I think it would bring? I mean, I think it's a way of I think reestablishing trust, essentially saying, like, acknowledging how the technology works, but then, essentially drawing a boundary about how it's going to be put to work over time. Jonathan's here, I'm sure could say a lot about this, but, using signage and other kinds of standards to help broadcast that into the public realm so people understand, this thing is no longer on the internet. It's just, or it's in the internet in a very limited way. That kind of physical firewalling of the sensing, the AI, and the data center, really. I think the cloud is something people, I think, are increasingly able to understand. And if you can explain it in a clear and compelling way, like at the point of activity. I think it's a great step forward. So yeah, I was excited to see that.
Yeah, there's a real gap from thinking about what a sensor is capable of and then deciding not to do everything that sensor is capable of. I think Paul's mentioning Numina. We know Upcity did similar things. And then having the public trust that it looks like a camera, it's not actually recording video. It looks like a microphone, but it's not actually recording sound. And that gap, still not sure the best way. I mean, we try with signage, but I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Well, fascinating discussion. We could go on for hours with this, and I hope we'll all reconvene around it in the future. Just want to highlight the 3 remaining sessions in the series next week. We're going to be taking another turn into really kind of uncharted space, talking about AI clothing for data privacy. And then on the 6th, Wiley Yi from Hayden AI, which is the company that is providing the bus lane enforcement cameras in New York City and other cities, is going to be talking about what they're doing and their plans. And then we'll wrap up at the end with Tom Sanchez, who's a urban planning scholar, who has been really surveying widely how AI is being used in urban planning and some of the ethical frameworks for thinking about it. So really excited about wrapping up season 3 on a strong note. So thank you all, and we hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.